Substance. The account of substance is given first, because all the other things are in substance, and depend upon it for their being. This both shows substance to be prior in nature, and reveals the account of substance as prior to that of the others. It is not possible to define substance, but the account of it Aristotle gives is not being in a subject. For substance underlies all the other genera, and the others cannot have being without it. There are three kinds of substance: matter, form, and the compound. The parts of compound substance are matter and form. There are differentiae of substance, of which some are primary, others secondary. For Porphyry, individuals are primary, for example Socrates and Plato. Genera and species are secondary substances. This is so because all other items are either said of these genera, or are in them as subjects. I mean the other 9 sorts of accidents. So if primary substances did not exist, none of the others would exist either. Thus, Porphyry concludes that that which is most of all a subject will also be most of all a substance. Why is man not prior to Socrates, if when man is eliminated, it eliminates Socrates as well, but it is not eliminated when Socrates is? Porphyry's response is that you must recognize that individual substance does not mean just one of the particulars, but rather all of the particular men, from whom we conceive the man that is predicated in common. These particulars are the cause of the being of the common predicates, koine kategorumena, for it is not possible to think of ox or man or horse or animal in general, apart from the particulars. If the particular animals are eliminated, what is predicated in common of them will no longer exist either. Aristotle thought that sensibles were the most properly primary of all substances, according to Porphyry, who believes rather that intelligibles are primary. His objection is that, with regards to significant expressions, sensible individuals are primary substances, but as regards nature, intelligible substances are primary. But Aristotle's intention is to distinguish the genera of being according to the expressions that signify them, and these primarily signify individual, sensible substances. For men first of all assign names to what they know and perceive, and only secondarily to those things that are primary by nature, but secondary with respect to perception. It is thus reasonable for him, Aristotle, to have called the things that are primarily signified by expressions, that is, sensibles and individuals, primary substances. And with this in mind, we can recall Plato's analogy of the divided line, which may be taken as a support for this process of proceeding from the tangible, sensible particulars towards the intelligible universals. And this is part of Porphyry's wider interest in trying to harmonize Aristotle and Plato. I claim that it is reasonable to call the genera and species of primary substances secondary substances, for they are the only predicates that reveal primary substance. For if someone states what Socrates is, he will do so properly if he gives his species and genus, i.e. man and animal. Primary substances are said to be substances most of all, malista, because they are the subjects for everything else, and everything else is said of them, either predicated of them as a subject, or being in them as a subject. A point that Porphyry is making here is that being primary in terms of ontology does not mean that these are prior in thought. Propria. There are 3 senses of the term proprium, one of which is the strictest sense of the term. Proprium is either what is a property of all the members of a kind, but not of them alone, or of only the members of a kind, but not of all of them, or what belongs to all and only the members of a kind, and this, the third option, is the strictest sense of the term. Only what was a property only of substances, and of all of them, would be a proprium of substance. For example, not being in a subject is common both to primary substances and to secondary substances, but it is not a property of substances alone, for it is also a property of the differentiae of substances, for they are not in a subject. But how can he say that not being in a subject is a common property of substances, when the parts of substances which are substances are in a subject, namely in the whole? For surely parts are in the whole. But being in a subject was defined as being in something but not belonging to it as a part. The parts of substances, such as a hand or an eye, are in the whole as parts, Accidents are therefore in a subject according to this definition, but the parts of substances are not in a subject. They are in substances as wholes, but as substances and not as accidents. A differentiae is that in virtue of which a particular species differs from other species, or that which is predicated as an essential qualification of a number of items differing in species. Thus differentiae belong to species and genera, not to individuals. If, then, a differentia is neither a substance nor an accident, what could it be? Aristotle says that it is not a mere quality, for then it would be an accident, nor a mere substance, but that it is an essential quality, poiotes ousiodes. Therefore it is not predicated in the essence of what it is predicated of, but as an essential qualification. For man is an animal, and the differentiae reveal what sort of animal he is, so that they will be essential qualities. So not being in a subject is a property of all substances, but not of substances alone, but also of differentiae. Hence it is not a proprium of substances in the strict sense of proprium. The term man does not merely indicate a quality, but indicates at least two things, for it reveals an essential quality as well as a commonality of the underlying substances. But white does not indicate an essential quality, nor a commonality of man, or ox, or stone, or of any other substance. It is a common property of every substance, qua being a substance, to receive contraries in turn. This would thus be a proprium of substance alone, which alone can undergo a change, and does not include in its essence the unchangeability of its qualities. Thus he defines the unique property of substance as to be receptive of contraries while being numerically one and the same. For example, Socrates is numerically one, but is receptive of health and sickness, and the same soul is receptive of wisdom and folly. Porphyry admits that he will not be able to show this for the case of eternal substances. Thus he says let us suppose that the discussion does not concern eternal substances. Is this a cop-out? Let us see how Porphyry works around this difficulty. Particular substances, i.e. those which are numerically one, are receptive of those contrarieties that are external to them, and these are none other than the other 9 categories. And since individual substance which is numerically one has this property, so do secondary substances. For if Socrates is virtuous and foolish, so also will man be virtuous and foolish, and animal as well, since Socrates is both an animal and a man. So as substance, man and animal are receptive of contraries, since man is a substance and animal is a substance. But as universals they are not receptive of them, rather the items that fall under them are. So we must consider man and animal qua substance, to see whether they remain while receiving contraries in turn. This would thus be a proprium of substance alone, which alone can undergo a change, and does not include in its essence the unchangeability of its qualities. This answer appears to hinge on Porphyry's understanding of sensible particulars as primary substance, and assumes that the universals are at least approached through a process of abstraction from particulars. We may recall here Abelard's notion of simple and determinate potencies, for which we find a kind of foothold in this passage. Abelard's idea of simple potency related to natures or universals, and he saw the limits of a universal nature, for example of mankind, as being defined by the sum total of individuals instantiating that nature. Thus if just one particular man had red hair, one might infer that the property of having red hair is predicated of mankind as such, as a potency of human nature. Porphyry's understanding of substance here appears to admit such a logical framework, as we have seen already in his classification of primary and secondary substances. This is not without its difficulties, however, for Porphyry is no nominalist, and wants to uphold the ontological priority of the intelligible universals. We can therefore understand how and why his works, although accepted by subsequent philosophers as part of the curriculum, provoke debate. Quantity. Quantity is distinct from quality. A body, to be a body, has to be three-dimensional, whereas to be a qualified body it has to be white or black, for example. Being a body precedes being a qualified body. In general, quantity is nearer to substance than are the other sorts of accidents. There are 2 types of quantity, discontinuous and continuous. There are also 2 types of composition, what is composed of parts that have position relative to one another, and what is composed of parts that do not have position. In the case of discrete or discontinuous quantity, there was nothing else that intervened to join its parts together. But continuous quantity does have a common boundary joining its parts to one another. For example, in the case of a line which is an interval without breadth, its parts appear as continuous with one another, so that when one part is moved, the other parts move along with it. Surface is a continuous quantity, as is body. A surface is the limit of a body, not a part of it. But why is a part different from a limit? Because a whole is composed of its parts, but it cannot be composed of limits. For a line can never be composed of points. It has a point as its limit, but this point is not part of it, but rather a limit. And among the continuous quantities, Porphyry lists place and time. What is it not to have relative position, and what is it to have it? To have a relative position, 3 conditions need to be met: the place where the parts are located, the parts themselves which do not disappear, the continuity of the parts with one another. He gives the example of 10 jars on the ground, which have no continuity with one another, thus lacking relative position. Again, in the case of water flowing from a pipe, the parts are continuous with one another, but the previous parts cannot be pointed to, nor do they remain, but as soon as they flow out of the hole they disappear. They possess order, but not position. This is so in the case of time as well. Motion, too, is something continuous, but it does not exhibit position. And motion is not a quantity, but something that participates in quantity. These are primary quantities, but there are also accidental quantities, the former being number, time, etc., the latter being specific bodies or surfaces, etc. We reckon motion, kinesis, quantitatively, by the time it takes. It is not classed as a quantity itself, however. Likewise with change, for change is considered a kind of motion by Aristotle. Now, as Porphyry goes through each of the categories, he attempts to pick out the proprium of each one, and as we have seen, proprium in a strict sense is the defining property of a class or term. As such, if the property does not cover the whole class of things, or if it is applicable to anything outside that class, it is not a true proprium. Porphyry's approach throughout this commentary is dialectical, a method he may have picked up from his teacher Plotinus, who adopted the Socratic method in his classes. This allows Porphyry to interrogate his own provisional definitions of the proprium for each category, and to arrive at what he considers to be a more exact account in each case. The first definition for the proprium of quantity as such is that quantity has nothing contrary to it. For example, nothing is contrary to line as such, nor to surface as such, nor is there any contrary in the case of number, for what could be contrary to 2 as such, or to 5, or in general to any number? However, contrariety seems to exist in the case of some indefinite quantities. For example, the terms much and little are contrary to one another. These are not quantities in the strict sense, however, but they are rather relatives and thus qualities. Quantity, for example, 2 cubits, 3 cubits, surface and so forth, is not said relative to anything else, but large and small are said relative to something else. Therefore large and small are not quantities. Likewise, in the case of the terms many and few, he gives the following example. If a group of 3,000 people happened to be in Athens, we would say that they were few. But if there were a group of 300 people in a village, we would say that there were many, even though the group in Athens was many times larger. As a definition of the proprium of quantity, that which does not admit a contrary must only be applicable to quantity as such, and not to another category as well. Thus, as Porphyry notes that the same may be said of other categories, i.e. that they do not admit a contrary, this cannot be a proprium of quantity, strictly speaking. For example, while substance may admit contraries, the category of quality has no contrary, but it can hardly be classed as a quantity. Porphyry thus offers a different proprium of quantity, that is, to be called equal and unequal. For a line will either be equal or unequal to another line, and a body will be either equal or unequal to another body, and a surface will be either equal or unequal to another surface. End of part 2.